My father used to say that a man's worth isn't measured by what he builds, but by what he protects. He said it to me once, standing in the driveway of the house I grew up in. The same house where my mother still lives, the same house where she raised 4 children on a schoolteacher's salary and never once complained about what she didn't have. I was maybe 19 when he said it. I didn't understand it then. I understand it now, at 63, in a way that cost me more than I ever expected to pay. So when I tell you that the woman my son married walked into my mother's kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon and left her on the floor, I need you to understand something first. That wasn't a family argument that got out of hand. That was a decision. And decisions like that don't happen in a single afternoon. They build, they plan, and by the time you finally see them clearly, you realize you were looking at them the whole time and just calling it something else. Welcome to Dad's Pure Revenge, sons and daughters. I'm glad you're here tonight. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Hit like if stories like this one matter to you, and stay with me. Because what happened 11 days after that afternoon is something that changed everything I thought I knew about the people closest to me. My mother's name is Dorothy May Calloway. She is 81 years old. She stands 5 feet, even in her house slippers, and she has a voice so soft that you have to lean in to hear her, which she never minded because she always said if something is worth saying, it's worth making the other person come closer. She lives in the same pale yellow house in Decatur, Georgia, where she's lived since 1974. The hydrangeas along the front porch are hers. The vegetable garden in the back, too. Every August, she puts up 17 jars of bread and butter pickles, counts them out loud when she lines them up on the pantry shelf, and writes the year on each lid in black marker. She gave me a jar every Christmas for 40 years. I still have the last one she gave me before all of this happened. I can't bring myself to open it. After my father passed, 8 years ago now, my mother did what strong women of her generation do. She kept going. She paid her own bills. She drove herself to church and to the grocery store and to her Thursday morning Bible study group. She called me every Sunday evening at 6 o'clock, not 6:05, not 5:58, 6 o'clock exactly, and we talked for 40 minutes, give or take, about nothing in particular and everything that mattered. She never asked me for a single thing she couldn't ask for in the same breath she offered something in return. I am Raymond Calloway. I'm 63. I retired 2 years ago from 31 years with the County Water Authority in DeKalb County, and if there is one thing I know about myself that I have to be honest with you about tonight, it is this. I trusted my son's judgment the way my father trusted mine. Maybe too much. Maybe in ways I should have questioned sooner. That's the part I carry. I own it. My son Marcus is 41. He married a woman named Sandra 8 years ago in a ceremony that cost more than my first car, and I paid for the flowers without being asked because that's what fathers do. Sandra was charming in the beginning. That's the word I keep coming back to. Not warm, not kind, charming. There's a difference, and I wish I had understood it sooner. The first sign was small, the way first signs always are. About 3 years into the marriage, my mother mentioned, offhand, that Sandra had asked her some questions about the house. Whether she had a will. Whether I was listed anywhere on the deed. My mother laughed when she told me. Said she figured Sandra was just being thorough. I laughed too. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself Sandra was just the type who liked to have things organized. I was wrong about what kind of organizing she had in mind. Sunday dinners at my mother's house slowed down after that. There was always a reason. Marcus had a work commitment. Sandra wasn't feeling well. The drive was too far. I stopped pressing because Marcus would get quiet when I did, and I didn't want to put him in the middle of something I couldn't name yet. So I let it sit. I let it sit for 4 years, and that is on me. Tuesday, March the 4th. I know the date because it was the day after my granddaughter Lily's 9th birthday, and I had been at Marcus's house the night before for the birthday dinner, and everything had seemed fine. Ordinary. Sandra had smiled and cut the cake and taken photographs. I had driven home that night thinking to myself that maybe I'd been reading too much into things. The call came at 2:17 in the afternoon. It wasn't my mother calling. It was her neighbor, a man named Curtis Webb, who lives directly across the street and has been watching over my mother's house since long before my father died. Curtis is 74. He has a bad back and walks with a cane on cold mornings, and he still goes out every single day to pull the newspaper out of the boxwood hedge where the carrier always throws it short and walk it up to my mother's porch before she can bend down for it herself. He calls her Miss Dot. Has for decades. Raymond. His voice was tight. You need to come right now. Miss Dot's been hurt. Sandra was here. I already called 911. I asked him how bad. He paused just long enough to tell me everything. She's on the kitchen floor, Raymond. She's conscious. Just come. I left my house without my jacket. I don't remember getting in the car. I remember hitting the interstate and watching the speedometer and telling myself to stay under 90 because I was no good to my mother if I didn't get there. I called Marcus on the way. He picked up on the third ring, and before I could say a single word, he said, "Dad, I know. Sandra called me. She said, Mom, she said Grandma Dorothy got upset and fell. She said she tried to help her, but Grandma wouldn't let her." I want you to sit with that for a moment. My mother. 81 years old, 5 feet even. The woman who has never raised her voice at another human being in her entire life. And Sandra's version of events was that she got upset and fell. Marcus, I said. Curtis Webb saw it. Curtis was right there. Silence on his end. Then, Dad, just let's not jump to anything until we know what happened. I hung up. Not out of anger. Out of the understanding that this phone call was not going to get me to my mother any faster. Grady Memorial had her in a treatment room by the time I arrived. 2 cracked ribs, a deep contusion across her left forearm that the attending physician told me, quietly and with some care in his voice, was consistent with a defensive wound. A split along her lower lip where she had hit the edge of the counter on the way down. She was lying in a hospital gown that swallowed her, and when she saw me in the doorway, the first thing she did was reach up and pat the side of her own face like she was checking to make sure she was presentable. "Raymond, baby," she said. "I'm all right. Don't make a fuss." I sat beside her and held her hand with both of mine, and I did not make a fuss. Not in that room. Not in front of her. But I want to tell you what my mother told me in that room, slowly, between the pauses where breathing still hurt her. Sandra had come over unannounced. She had brought paperwork. She had sat down at my mother's kitchen table and laid out a document that she described as a family financial trust. Something simple, she had said, just to make sure everyone was protected. The house would go into the trust. A joint account that my mother had maintained with my name on it as an emergency signatory would be folded in as well. All my mother had to do was sign. My mother said no, not loudly, not unkindly. She said she would need to talk to me first and to her own attorney before she signed anything that touched her house. She said it the way she says everything, gently and plainly, and then she stood up to offer Sandra a glass of sweet tea, because that is who my mother is. Sandra didn't want sweet tea. What happened next happened fast, my mother said. Words first. Words I will not repeat here, because they came out of a mouth I had watched smile at my granddaughter's birthday dinner, fewer than 24 hours earlier. And then something came off the kitchen counter. A heavy ceramic bowl, my mother's mixing bowl that she has owned since before I was born. And it caught her across the arm when she raised it up to shield her face, and she went down. Curtis heard the crash from across the street. He said later, when he gave his statement, that he'd been watching the house for about 20 minutes before that, because Sandra's car parked out front in the middle of a Tuesday had put him on edge. He didn't know why. He just said something felt off in the way that 74 years of paying attention to your surroundings teaches you to read a street. He didn't come inside first. He called 911 first, because he said he was too old to help her up off the floor by himself, and he wasn't going to make it worse. And then he went inside, and he sat down on the kitchen floor next to my mother, and he held her hand the same way I was holding it right now in this hospital room. And he talked to her until the ambulance came. He told me later he just kept telling her that the hydrangeas out front were looking beautiful, and asked her what she thought about putting in a rose of Sharon this spring. Just kept talking so she'd stay focused on something familiar. When I tell you that I went to find Sandra that evening, I want to be clear about what I mean. I went to Marcus's house. Not to confront, not to escalate. I went because I am a 63-year-old man who spent 31 years managing infrastructure that, if it failed, affected the water supply of 300,000 people, and I learned a long time ago that you do not raise your voice when you need someone to hear you. Marcus met me at the door. Sandra was inside. I could see her through the glass panel, sitting at the kitchen island with a glass of wine, and something about that particular image has stayed with me in a way I can't fully explain. I said to Marcus, standing on his front porch in the cold, "She cracked 2 of your grandmother's ribs." She split her lip. The neighbor witnessed it and has already given a statement. Whatever Sandra told you on that phone call today, I need you to understand that those are the facts. Marcus looked at me for a long time. Then he looked through the glass at his wife. And then he looked back at me, and I watched something move behind his eyes that I recognized. It was the same thing I'd been doing for 4 years. He was trying to find the version of events that let him keep the peace. "Dad," he said. "She said it was an accident." I drove home. I called my attorney the next morning, and over the following 11 days, while Sandra was charged with felony battery of an elderly person, while Marcus sat in a silence that I can only describe as the loudest thing I have ever heard from him, while the evidence collected from Sandra's own phone records and from the estate attorney she had visited 4 months earlier began to tell a story I had only understood in pieces up until now, I learned the full shape of what had been building in my family's blind spot for years. Sandra had spoken to a private estate planner, not our family's attorney, a separate one, about the process of establishing a revocable trust that would consolidate assets before a transfer of property. My mother's house, which was paid off, valued at just under $400,000 in the current market, was the asset. The joint emergency account my mother kept with my name on it held $63,000, savings from 50 years of a school teacher's life. She had added my name to that account years ago in case anything ever happened, and she needed me to act quickly. She told me about it once, and then never mentioned it again, because that's how my mother handles things she considers taken care of. Sandra had apparently told the estate planner that she was acting on behalf of her husband, meaning Marcus, and that the family had agreed to the arrangement. They had not. My mother had not agreed. I had not been told it existed. When my mother had sat down at her own kitchen table 2 weeks before that Tuesday afternoon and been shown that paperwork for what turned out to be the second time, she had said no for the second time, and that was when the calendar began counting down to March the 4th. The detective assigned to the case was a woman named Investigator Tamara Osei, out of the DeKalb County Major Crimes Unit. She called me on day 3 and asked me to come in and walk her through the financial timeline because what had started as a battery charge was beginning to look, she said carefully, like it had additional dimensions. I went in that same afternoon. I sat across a table from her, and I did not rush, and I did not editorialize. I laid out what I knew in the order I learned it, and I let the paperwork I had already gathered from my own records do the talking. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at me. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to take a moment before you answer. Does your son know about the estate planner?" I told her I didn't know what Marcus knew, and that was the honest answer. What I know now, because the records eventually made it clear, is that Marcus had signed one preliminary document, not the trust itself. A document that he later told his own attorney he had believed was related to a life insurance beneficiary update that Sandra had told him was routine. Whether that's true, whether he was a participant or a prop, is something I have had to make my own peace with in private, because it is the question I cannot answer for certain, and I have decided I will not answer it in anger. Sandra was arrested on day 6. She was charged with felony battery against an elderly person, exploitation of an elder or disabled adult, and 1 count of attempted financial fraud related to the estate documents. The last two charges required additional time to build, but the battery charge was clean and immediate because Curtis Webb's statement was clear, the hospital documentation was clear, and a neighbor 2 doors down had a doorbell camera that had captured Sandra's car arriving and departing, and a partial view of the front window, in which, according to the detective, movement consistent with the reported incident was visible. She did not get probation. I want to be clear about that for the people watching tonight who have seen these stories end with a slap on the wrist and a restraining order that means nothing. She did not get probation. The felony elder battery charge in Georgia carries real weight, and the additional fraud dimensions meant that a plea to a lesser arrangement was not on the table the way she and her attorney apparently anticipated. She was sentenced to 4 years, with the possibility of early release after 28 months, plus 5 years of probation following. The civil case related to the attempted financial fraud is ongoing. Marcus did not serve time. He was interviewed at length, and ultimately the evidence supported his account that he had been misled about the document he signed. I believe that. I have had to decide to believe it, not because it is easy, but because the alternative requires me to accept that my son is someone I do not recognize. And I have lived 63 years and raised that boy, and I know what he is, even when he is weak. Being weak is not the same as being wicked. I know the difference. What happened between Marcus and me is a longer and quieter story. He called me on day 9. He did not call to explain himself or defend Sandra. He called and he said, "Pop." Just that one word. And he stopped. And I let him stop. And after a long silence he said, "I looked away from things I should have looked at. I know that. I've known it for a while." He did not ask me to forgive him that night. I think he understood it was too soon for that conversation to mean anything. We are working on it. That is all I will say. We are working on it the way two people work on something that matters when they both know the damage is real and neither one of them can afford to walk away from the other permanently. My mother came home from the hospital after 4 days. Her ribs will take weeks to heal fully. She is not supposed to lift anything heavier than a coffee cup for another month. When I went to her house to set things up for her return, Curtis Webb had already been there. He had restocked her refrigerator, set her pill organizer for the week, and put a small pot of white begonias on the kitchen table where the ceramic mixing bowl used to sit. The mixing bowl is gone. I removed it myself. She never asked me where it went and I didn't tell her. Lily, my granddaughter, Marcus's daughter, drew a picture for great-grandma Dorothy in crayon. A yellow house with hydrangeas out front, pink and blue. Stick figures on the porch, one tall with a cane, one small with white hair. Lily is 9. She drew it without being asked, and she asked me to make sure great-grandma put it somewhere she could see it. My mother taped it to the refrigerator door that same evening. She called me later to tell me. Her voice, for the first time since all of this, sounded like itself. I have done several things in the 11 days since March the 4th, and the weeks that followed that I want to tell you about, not because they are dramatic, but because they are the things I would tell any man my age who finds himself holding damage he didn't see coming. I had my own attorney review every document connected to my name and my mother's name, everything. I updated my own will, clearly and explicitly. I established a separate legal arrangement for my mother's house that requires dual consent for any transfer or encumbrance. I added Curtis Webb as an emergency contact on my mother's file at her doctor's office, at her church, and at the County Senior Services Registry, because that man sat on a kitchen floor in his bad knees and talked about hydrangeas until the ambulance came. And that kind of person should have the official standing to make a phone call on your behalf. And I did one more thing. I went to Curtis's house the Saturday after my mother got home, and I brought him a jar of bread and butter pickles from her pantry, the ones from last August, because she told me to. She said those jars are for people worth feeding, and she'd decided he'd earned a whole shelf. He laughed. He said he didn't do any of it for pickles. I told him that was exactly why he was getting them. I am not standing here tonight feeling like I won something. I want to be honest with you about that, sons and daughters, the same way I told myself I would be honest when I started talking. I am 63 years old, and I watched my 81-year-old mother lie in a hospital bed with cracked ribs, and no legal outcome changes the image of her reaching up to pat her own face when I walked through that door, checking to see if she was presentable. That image belongs to me now. I carry it. What I feel instead of triumph is something I have been trying to find the right word for. The closest I've come is accountable. I am accountable now in the ways I was not accountable before. I see what I let sit. I see the Sunday dinners I didn't question. I see the moment I heard that first question about the house deed and laughed it off and chose the smoother road. I see all of it with the lights on now, and I'd rather see it clearly and carry it than go back to the comfortable version where I told myself everything was fine because it was easier. Here's what I want to leave you with tonight, and I want you to hear it from a man who is old enough to know the difference between advice and hard-won truth. The people in your life who go soft when they're hurting, who protect you from what they're going through, who would rather sit quietly with something wrong than put you in the middle of it, those people are not fine just because they say they're fine. My mother never called me once in 4 years to tell me something was wrong. Not once. She adjusted. She went quiet. She came to Sunday dinner less and never explained why, because she was trying to protect me from a conflict she couldn't yet prove. Check on them, not with a text, not with a happy birthday phone call. Actually, show up. Sit across the table. Ask the question you've been not asking because it might make things complicated. Complications are survivable. The alternative isn't always. Subscribe to Dad's Pure Revenge if you want more stories like this one, sons and daughters. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and tell me about the person in your life who goes quiet when something's wrong. I'll read every one. I'll see you in the next story.